On 24th of April, Trump signed an executive order that legalized the mining of the deep sea. The first 2 US-backed projects have already begun around the Cook Islands. 56 other island projects are now underway. The Trump administration has gone further and started granting permits to the right to mine in international waters to companies from all over the world in exchange for US gaining a proportion of their profits and the first refusal rights over supply. Let us be clear, this is not a debate on whether we should support deep sea mining. That is an inevitable reality on both sides. The only question is who should do it. Should the US alone dominate deep sea mining, or the ISA, which represents 169 member states? What is our model? Companies and nations seeking mining rights must apply for a license based on the viability of detailed mining plans and must fully comply with the following terms. 1. Environmental safeguards. We would implement environmental impact assessments by independent scientists, ban activity in biodiversity hotspots, require use of technology that mitigates harm like noise emissions and degradation, etc. 2. Benefit sharing. Research and development will be shared and a royalty fee will be paid to the ISA to be redistributed through a global fund to developing member states. Our royalty fee will be lower than the US, and we will not demand first refusal rights over the supply. 3. Accountability. Satellite and remote sensing can ensure real-time monitoring. Mining permits will also expire after a period and are subject to renewal only if strict conditions are met and public review. Opt-in to our model is empirically likely, as 169 states and the EU are currently in the ISA. 4 additional reasons why countries have incentives to opt into our regulations. 1. A need for global regulator. The reason countries agree to join any international organization is to exchange their rights for limitations on other actors. It is in all countries' favor to prevent over-mining, monopoly, or territorial disputes in international waters, as well as having a system to resolve these disputes if they occur. This incentive is reversed when on off they see the ISA failing to regulate the market, and compliance with the ban while other actors mine limitations-free means they can gain nothing from compromising their own rights. 2. Shared benefits. Technologies and research that would be prohibitively expensive to develop independently, and participation in stable ISA-backed global supply chains can be done collaboratively in the ISA. In the absence, it costs $2 billion annually for these nations to mine. These monetary efficiency benefits only manifest if mining is legalized to collaboratively develop and utilize these technologies. 3. Legal risk. When there is a viable legal option for deep sea mining, actively choosing the illegal path increases the perceived risk and cost of legal arbitration. Risk-averse investors prefer safer options for creating sustainable revenue. If left with no options, they earn for the riskier illegal option or with no mining at all. 4. Competitive advantage over the US. The US demands first refusal rights, which gives the holder the first opportunity to buy the supply, which significantly limits their ability to tap into diverse consumer markets and have negotiation power on the price of supply. The ISA contract offers higher profitability through not requiring these first refusal rights, but if it leaves them with no alternative, they will be forced to accept American demands. Before I move on to our arguments, I'll take that feedback.
Okay, Pat, very simple intuition. You can't see underwater. How do you ensure environmental protection and the fact that countries will only mine a specific amount in a specific area?
You can literally have the ISA members on board the ship if you want to, and you actually have to, when you sell these mining, you can see how much people mine, right? So, I have 2 arguments to support legalization. Firstly, on the necessity to break the US-China duopoly controlling REMs. Secondly, on the benefits to the environment and human rights. First argument then, on breaking the duopoly the US and China have over rare earth minerals. China controls over 90% of the global supply of rare earth minerals today, produced in onshore mines in South China. The US actions to rapidly mine the deep sea and its first refusal rights over the proceeds mean that without ISA authority, we will have an effective duopoly with the US and China dominating the supply chain. This dominance has 4 major harms I'll pass it back. A. Setting uncompetitive practices. This duopoly allows uncompetitive practices, such as China's export caps on minerals, creating an artificial supply shortage. This is no longer a viable strategy when multiple suppliers compete on our side. B. Inequitable access to REM. The artificial shortage leads to massive price increases and access barriers to REM. This makes them inaccessible to poor developing nations. On our side, we enable smaller nations to access REMs, guarantee resource and development sharing among states, and redistribute royalties to developing nations. C. Political weaponization. On off, the US can weaponize their control of REMs to serve their self-interest. In 2010, China banned REMs to exports to Japan over a fishing dispute. In 2023, it imposed similar restrictions on the US in retaliation of sanctions on the sale of semiconductors. The US would likely take a similar action. On our side, decreased market dominance leads to decreased political leverage. D. Abuse of human rights and the environment. On off, REM production is dominated by the two least accountable actors that have no regard for the international law. On our side, it is divided between many nations that are accountable to ISA regulations. Only immediate recognition can reduce the risk of a US-China duopoly and the associated harms. Second argument then, on preventing environmental harms and abuse. Demand for REMs doesn't disappear across, so supply must continue. Legalized deep-sea mining is far less damaging than the alternatives, which are onshore mining or illegal deep-sea mining. Before I move on to onshore mining, how it is worse for 4 reasons, I'll take that.
Okay, China only mines 40% of rare earth minerals, yet processes 90%. It is in the interest of other countries to import the remaining 50%. Why does this change on your side of the house?
Well, you just get alternatives, right? Geopolitical stability is not something that is ensured on both sides of the world. Second argument then, on preventing environmental harms and abuse, right? So onshore mining is just worse for 4 reasons. A, terrestrial mining is not regulated by any international body, so there is no regulation to minimize their environmental impact. B, the deep sea is less biodiverse since harsh conditions like darkness and pressure make survival difficult. This means remote from humans and animal habitats, deep sea mining emissions, filtered by tons of water, pose much less risk. It also means no deforestation or forced evacuations are needed for mine construction. C, deep sea mining is tech reliant, requiring no manual labor to operate, so structurally incapable of workers' abuse. D, the high concentration of minerals in several mining targets in the deep sea allows localizing and minimizing the scale of harms. The main candidate for deep sea mining is the Clarion Clipperton Zone in the Pacific, with the ISA issuing over 15 exploration licenses in the area. Research suggests this zone alone contains more REMs than all land deposits combined. It is far easier to extract similar or greater amounts of REMs in a smaller targeted area. Secondly, unregulated illegal deep-sea mining is also worse. A, race to the bottom. The supply shortage and reliance on law pushes countries to compete to extract minerals as fast as they can, cutting through environmental protections and labor rights. B, green R&D is uniquely incentivized on our side of the world. To meet ISA standards and secure licenses, companies will develop mining technologies to minimize environmental harms. They have no incentive to do so when they can mine illegally on their side. Hence, legalized deep-sea mining is the best alternative for the environment and protecting human rights. So proud to propose.
I would like to find out second for action speech, and I'll call upon the first competition session.
Already. Dear panel, is it really worth it to sacrifice nature just to artificially keep alive an industry based on metals, poisoning our water, food, and environment? Before I get to my points, let's notice the tension in proposition's case, because they give us multiple reasons on why countries uphold ISA regulations, like getting sued, like international backlash, etc. They said it themselves. Then they tell you the USA simply wouldn't care about any of this. So either the USA wouldn't deep sea mine, or countries will, but illegally. We tell you that the USA falls to the same scrutiny as, for example, China would. We don't buy why there is a crucial difference. They have to resolve this tension, and we believe that it is such that the USA will get scrutinized, they will get sued, this type of stuff will happen. No bank will give these companies a huge loan because they don't want to face this backlash. But even if it will, like our worst case scenario, the USA wouldn't uphold environmental regulations on your side anyway. So it will still be the cheapest option, pushing others to skimp out on this regulation. Because no matter what fines you said and what other type of things you said, if the USA simply ignores the environmental regulations, so will have the other countries, because then mining wouldn't make any economical sense. But on China, we believe that China doesn't have a mining monopoly. They control like 40% of these rare earth metals. But they like provingly have a processing monopoly. 90% of the rare earth metal processing happens in China. Like here's four structural reasons on why this processing is likely to remain China, making this monopoly unbroken. We believe that firstly, they have the know-how. They essentially have the setup infrastructure to already process these metals, unlikely to move elsewhere. Secondly, they have low labor and low environmental regulations. So when these metals get mined, they will likely still get shipped to China. Thirdly, they have long-term processing contracts, and the companies which hold these processing contracts are likely to be the ones mining. And lastly, this mining is subsidized, right? Which means that processing will still remain in China even after deep sea mining. Whoever will mine it will get it shipped to China to get their products. Having done with that, two crucial points of framing. First, what is our stance on rare earth metals? We simply won't support them in any capacity. We won't subsidize them, we won't do anything. Why am I telling you this? Because it's over time, we simply won't need these metals, right? Why is this likely? We already use coal, mercury, lead, asbestos. We have zinc, which had negative externalities, and we started getting rid of them. It is possible it will be proved later on in my argument. But the second crucial piece of framing, what is proposition's burden here? It is to prove that there is a tipping point, and why specifically we should start this irreversible mining process right now. Why is it irreversible? I will tell you this by explaining how deep sea mining works. First, you pick up rocks. These rocks are dirty, right? And in between there's sediment, and you drag this sediment for 4 kilometers through the water column, releasing dirt everywhere as you go. And on the ship, you wash these rocks and you throw this dirt overboard. Why is this irreversible? Firstly, this dirt from overboard and released in the water column doesn't settle for tens of years. These are tiny specks of dust, not really pushing down, just being shoved by the ocean currents, having huge water resistance. Secondly, you turn this thing upside down by making these rocks up. And lastly, the rocks simply don't come back. The environment on the seafloor is permanently changed, right? First argument then, you ruin the environment on 4 levels. Cobalt is horrible, biodiversity is decreased on the carbon cycle and the impact of humans. On proving the harms of cobalt, let's analyze this metal, right? It's incredibly toxic to all organisms and accumulates in your body. And right now, it's like stably in these nodules. What happens with deep sea mining? It gets released in 2 levels, mining and processing. On mining, it simply gets disrupted because it is in these nodules. It's not a rare earth metal, but it is contained largely in these nodules, right? And it gets mechanically scratched, easily released, easily dissolves into the water, and it permanently accumulates. It doesn't leave the food chain because it is ate by the plankton. The plankton is ate by the fish. And guess who eats the fish panel? This is exactly where cobalt enters our bodies. And literally, the concentration of cobalt in these areas increased tenfold after experimental mining. Imagine what would happen if we employed industrial scale mining. But even if the companies were super careful and we pick up these nodules with velvet tools, it still needs to be processed. And there's only 7 metals in these nodules, which need to be separated, detoxified, right? It needs to be get rid of. And this byproduct will probably be dumped in the ocean because getting rid of this is the main expense of all other companies that deal with toxic byproduct. And the ocean is simply vast, so we will simply push it in there and not care about this. Having proved why the cobalt will stay in the food chain hardy environment, on biodiversity. 2 layers here. First, it is morally unjust, and second, you lose out on medical innovations. On morality, panel, scientists don't know about 90% of species, but they know what the majority of them looks like. They are incredibly fragile, used to zero light, zero noise, very specific salinity, acidity. These conditions haven't shifted for literal millions of years, right? And now, proposition comes in here with a huge boat, with lights on it, with huge cables. These species cannot protect themselves, they cannot consent, they gain nothing, and everything is that they lose. Like tens of thousands of fish and other organisms are killed with each and every mining venture. On medical innovations, we believe that these creatures are adjusted to the harsh conditions of the deep sea, right? They possess mechanisms of survival, and we already use them for example, cancer immunotherapy and antibiotics fighting resistant bacteria. This is exactly the type of thing which we use these creatures for. And proposition just destroys all innovation because it permanently pollutes this water. Having put the negative impact on fishes and on medical innovations on the carbon cycle, because proposition actually increases climate change. Some explanation. Ocean is the biggest carbon sink in the world. It holds 50 times more carbon in the atmosphere. 50 times. And green plankton eats this carbon from the atmosphere and then dies, sinks to the seafloor, and deposits the carbon over there. So what does proposition do? First, they bulldoze this carbon. They release it back into this ocean, back into the upper layers through diffusion. And secondly, they create murky water. So there's less light and there's more carbon in the ocean. What happens? The plankton photosynthesizes is less and it uses carbon from the water, not from the air. Now remember, 50% of our oxygen is created at the ocean. Every second inhale you make, you can thank the ocean. And to know that only 0.5% of the ocean holds the exact same amount of carbon as the entire humanity has ever released. These are huge impact. This is exactly why thousands of scientists have signed a letter saying to stop. And once again, only from humans, on 2 ways, direct physical and psychological. On physical, we literally kill things like fish, shellfish, and things these things eat, right? Less fish affects 40% of people in the world that rely on protein, right? They have to fish more, then they overfish, therefore either fish or humans die. On psychology, a lot of people simply like nature, and they right now feel it's threatened. And if they see these deep sea creatures washed up on the shores, dead, if they imagine the huge trawlers mining these rocks, filtering through the sediment, killing all of these filter feeders, that is when they are going to be incredibly depressed, because climate depression is real bad. Before my second argument, I can make a point.
The paradigm that you need to defend is not no countries like literally mining in deep sea. We provided you reason as to why US and China.
I told you why there exists this tension, why China and the US both care about international scrutiny, which you yourself analyze. Second argument is crowding out, because deep sea mining prevents us in developing better technology. What happens? Rare earth metals are mined and companies make tech relying on it, knowing that they can rely on it. Therefore, this consumption goes up. There's more and more demand for it, more and more products that use it. Therefore, you never stop mining on what the proposition says. You never stop mining in the jungle or DRC. But on the counterfactual, you don't have the option to include these metals, right? So you have to get creative. Therefore, more so companies in opposition need to decrease their reliance on rare earth metals. We already see less and less lithium being used in batteries as lithium is running out. You get pushes from different sources, like cobalt-less EVs, like Build Your Dreams, the largest EV manufacturer in the world, already using sodium batteries in their newest models. This is why you will not need this. So what does proposition do with these rare earth metals? In the current world, it is used only in wind turbines. These wind turbines are incredibly hated by people. They kill birds. You have limited space to build them, and they are destroyed by climate change. The more climate change is, the stronger winds there are, the more turbines are broken. Now, what is the consequence of proposition? Because the majority of green tech is from green funds, which are used as investment vehicles. And now, comes a reaction to our climate change point, right? Because this limited capital is just spent on wind turbines and profit. They are the cheapest option. They are the most profit generating. But this is the most hated one. So what is actually comparative? They have more wind turbines. What we actually have is more new innovative tech like sodium batteries. We have more abundant materials used in these batteries, will improve the life cycle because they are more abundant. They're more cost efficient due to being found and using less material. And even if it's expensive, we at least don't pollute the environment. That is exactly why we win this debate.
I'd like to thank our speaker for another excellent speech, and now we'll call the prop 2.
If I speak like this, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I want to do two things at the top of my speech. First, I want to respond to their claims about the efficacy of our model not being well enough done. Their POI that, for example, we can't see underwater. And then second, I want to talk about how they claim there's an inherent tension in our case in regards to the US. Firstly, can you see underwater? Now, the first thought is obviously you use swimming goggles, but on a more realistic and actual practical level on defending the efficacy of regulations, a few things. One, the contract stipulates there is some obligation for countries to sufficiently report necessary information for themselves. This creates a legally binding contract on the part of the country. Second, even if the company and country itself doesn't provide sufficient information, there's incentive for its competitors to report potentially problematic behavior. This creates inherent checks and balances against each other. And thirdly, in scenarios where the ISA needs to verify such facts, ISA has the capacity to investigate and impose punishments if necessary. For example, the share that ISA collects from companies, by using, for example, the share that ISA collects from companies' revenues, or other member states and companies that are complying with these rules, that want these rules to be enforced, or pre-existing facilities and resources, like the ISA having been conducting resources in prominent mining areas like the CCZ, or also just like deep sea mining areas being fairly limited and concentrated, meaning there's not much resource gaps. And you can see underwaters. From Frame, we talked about how there's things like satellites and remote sensing, but also things like reports that are mandated and water sample checks that can still be done. We would argue that you can see underwater, you can understand the environmental harm that occurs. The second thing I wanted to clarify at the top of my speech is this idea that if we claim that the four mechanisms from Frame stands, then the US likely also follows regulations there. There are two crucial problems with this line of analysis. One, the very fact that the US isn't in the ISA necessarily then creates there's just not a lot of restrictions that the US has to follow in the first place. So USA following regulations doesn't necessarily mitigate environmental damage anyway, because the environmental regulations the US is necessarily under contract to follow in the first place is very loose in nature. But also secondly, because the US and by extension probably countries like China are very different actors, the vast majority of what this debate is about. The vast majority of actors are first four mechanisms would apply. But in both worlds, we would argue that the US oftentimes can be an uncontrollable and oftentimes bad actor. We argued from first, and by extension I'll also explain now, that for example, international law is oftentimes just not followed by the US. In situations like this, what is more important than attempting to regulate the US, which is just not possible in those situations, is to both allow for other countries to do the same thing so that we can allow for the US-China duopoly to be taken down, and to mitigate the environmental harm that the US and China can cause by allowing for alternative ways to mine to be overcome. Crucially, the explanation then, why the US doesn't have to follow these international regulations. The intuition pump is fairly obvious. The US has circumvented international law and weaponized its infrastructure to its advantage many times before, and almost always has gotten away with it, so they have no reason to stop. It never joined the ICC, it is not subject to the ICJ, it invaded Iraq despite vetoes from the members of the UN Security Council, it imposed securities on foreign actors through SWIFT, even though the UN and WTO mandated them not to. This proves that the US is not an accountable actor. The delta of this debate then is not the US, but rather other countries and their mining. The second portion of my speech then, I want to engage to two main claims that comes from their bench. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the environment. Under this, I'm going to both prove that our environmental harms that we pose from our second argument outweigh their environmental harms, and secondly, I'm going to engage to climate depression. Firstly, how does the environmental harms we claim that occur in their world, how do we prove that these are worse than the great rhetoric we get from O1? Two reasons. One, we would argue that at worst, this is limited to national waters only, as they are only proximate to countries' coastal lines and hence to people and habitats. But also secondly, their claim is not a tipping point because there's a lot of other emitting technologies that exist in the water. There's a much more unique impact that manifests in our world. Crucially, there's just a lot of other things that already exist in the water that already do a lot of these harms. We don't think this is the unique harm. Our argument proves unique harm. We'd argue again that the environmental harms that they pose are not necessarily unique to their bench, but rather the environmental harms we pose are more important. In response to climate depression, I don't think this is a very good line of argument anyway. Obviously, the easy response on an intuitive level is to argue that things like media that's massively broadcast, for example, doomsday ideas about how CO2 emissions are going to kill us probably have the exact same impact on these people. It's unclear why more fish washing up on the shores, which already happens right now, is the tipping point for any of this mattering. Furthermore, finally, I would argue in response to everything they say about the environment, all of this is contingent on the efficacy of the ban, which we prove doesn't exist, and therefore crucially none of their argument can stand as long as they disprove that prerequisite premise. The other thing I want to engage to is their second argument about how mining never stops, and about how therefore there's less incentive to find alternatives. At the top on an intuitive level, the finding of alternatives is already being done, and we would argue that will continue to be done, crucially because, for example, deep sea mining can oftentimes be more of an expensive alternative. But also, I would argue that REMs, rare earth minerals, are always going to be important, and therefore alternatives can't be found in a lot of these fields. For example, strong permanent magnets for rotors for EVs or robotics and missile guidance systems, wind turbines, as well as MRI and X-ray machinery, or lenses for lithography systems that produce semiconductors or catalysts used in petroleum refining and catalytic converters of cars. Therefore, the supply of REMs crucially will always remain, or the demand will always remain. What's then more important is our first argument on proving to you where the supply comes from. We proved to you that the reliance on China and the US is debilitating to countries and their technological capacities, as it also holds back research. Finally, the last claim I want to respond to before my third extending argument is this idea that processing remains in China. The problem with this line of response is they prove the incentive for and so much capacity for China to do this processing, but they don't prove why other countries won't therefore develop similar technologies. For example, we would argue that other countries have massive incentive to do this, and this incentive obviously manifests in our world as well, for companies and countries to create such technologies. The know-how is fairly uneasy, the low regulations exist in a lot of other countries, and state subsidization can be found in other countries for technological advancements as well. We would argue that processing never has to remain in China, but also this was never the prerequisite for our case. Third and final argument in my speech then. Let's talk about preventing geopolitical disputes. The race for control over the production of rare earth minerals causes many disputes directly resulting from the illegality of deep sea mining. First, because there is no globally trusted actor to distribute permits in an agreeable manner. Both China and Russia are ISA members and accept its authority. In contrast, they fully reject the authority of the US. If US-backed companies start operating in the Arctic or the South China Sea with no ISA approval, the chances of aggravation are significantly higher than if the ISA backs companies from a neutral position without USA involvement. Secondly, the race for mineral dominance between China and the US leads both to escalate trade sanctions and drag their allies down with them, trying to prevent the advancement of mineral processing of their rival. On our side, the race for dominance is replaced for competition that prevents both from obtaining dominance. Thirdly, the Sino-American duopoly creates artificial supply shocks through their uncompetitive practices, increasing countries' incentive to take escalation risks to obtain mineral self-reliance. On our side, there will be no artificial shortage, reducing both the need to take needless risks for minerals and the profitability of those risks when prices go down. We would argue that we prevent geopolitical risks. This is a surefire impact. We can take this debate this way. On the environment, but also on preventing the duopoly, and finally on preventing geopolitical disputes, proud to stand on top.
I'd like to thank our speaker for another excellent speech, and now I'd invite
Only once we poison the last tree and the last fish will die, both side proposition realize you cannot eat money nor rare earth minerals. So proud to oppose. In this speech, let's look at why countries won't mine without ISA making it legal. Then let's look at the impact. Then on a split argument. So why countries won't mine? And I think that this is responding to their whole case because their whole case is built on someone mining, specifically the US. So several reasons why it doesn't happen. One, because they will have to mine in their exclusive economic zones. And if they actually know that mining is damaging to their environment, if they know that mining will kill fish there, they are unlikely to do so because they will lose out economically. Secondly, because they don't have the capacity to do so illegally. No bank will give them a loan for this $100 million project to go mining once they're doing illegal mining without the ISA approval. But secondly, no one is going to insure this $100 million operation that might fail, so they're not likely to do so. Thirdly, we tell you that no one wants to buy these metals. No, thank you. A lot of companies, such as Volvo, such as many other car companies, pledged that they won't use rare earth metals from the deep sea because it would ruin their PR. So who are you going to sell these rare earths to? Who is going to process them when they cannot then sell it to the companies because it would cost their contracts? That's a question they have to answer. Fourthly, because you don't want to go against international law. If you go into international waters, you can still be trialed. But fifthly, you get backlash from other countries. I think the US will get severe backlash when they actually deep sea mine from all the countries that cannot deep sea mine. This can look like not buying these metals from the US, but rather going to China, which is maybe their duopoly. I think that what I've proven here is that no one actually wants to mine in these deep sea waters if it's not legal by the ISA, and I think that this is quite frankly important. And I think that this is, for instance, the reason why Norway, even though they permitted deep sea mining, repealed this a year after they made it legal, because they knew that it was for nothing for them. Because until everyone deep sea mines, no one can deep sea mine because no one buys the things from you. right? Secondly then, on their like China point, on China-US duopoly, I just really want to talk about why it's likely still processed in China or the US, and I think that we've already gave you these directions, but let's actually look at why this is the only capacity you have, and that's because of the mining companies. The mining companies already have long-term contracts with these countries. They cannot just breach them and start making their minerals be processed somewhere else. They have already signed a contract with China that they will ship their minerals straight there to then be processed and made into like car batteries or whatever. And I think that this is very important because this means that they never break the duopoly, even if it was good, even though we proved in the first that it's not efficient because China has the infrastructure, China has the know-how, China has the trust, China has the subsidies from the government, right? Secondly then, on why landmines don't stop on their side, because that's something that they try to claim, that they try to derive impact from, right? We tell you that on like child labor and stuff like that, we tell you that even though this product might get cheaper and outcompeted by the deep sea, we tell you there's still incentive to mine on land, because the demand is also going up the more you use these metals that they try to talk about. So yes, landmines will still be open to satisfy the demand for rare earth minerals that is rising on their side and falling on ours. So yes, kids will still go to work. Even if they don't, I am still waiting for them to prove the impact. Why is it so good that these people won't go to work? Why is it so good that they cannot earn money? I'm waiting for them to prove it, right? Secondly then, we tell you like on legal mines, you already bought the land and you want to repay it in the stuff that you mine from that, so you're still likely to mine in artisanal mines because the most expensive thing was the land and you need to repay that in the minerals that you would need to mine. On our content then, that we brought forward to you, and I really want to stress this because there's a very small amount of reaction we get from the side of proposition on all the stuff we talked about in the medical field. We tell you there's just such a big potential, not only potential, we know it's there. We know that the organisms have to somehow get into these adverse conditions and live there. We know that there's things that can kill the bacteria that are now becoming resistant to our antibiotics and killing hundreds, no, thousands of people each year, and it will get worse and worse and worse the more they're resistant to antibiotics. No, thank you. Well, this is very important because we tell you the things in the deep sea could have never met what the bacteria we as people have because it's like so distant. What this means is that the things from the deep sea, the antibiotics from there, is like they have our bacteria have no resistance for that. So we can cure things like golden staphylococcus, which causes meningitis, which is now making people die and making people sick. Please don't underestimate this impact because it's so important. It's the only thing actually impacted here, right? Secondly then, on like the ocean ecosystem, we tell you it's so connected. Like if deep sea fish die, or the stuff in the deep sea dies, it's very bad because guess what? Something eats the fish from the deep sea, and then something will eat the something that eats the fish from the deep sea. Everything in the ocean is connected, and this is very problematic once you actually kill the fish from the deep sea, because the normal fish are not alive, no one can eat them, no thank you. The 40% of the world population that is dependent on oceans for their livelihoods will also have problems on their side. And like, also let's talk about the stuff that they talk about in like magnets, because it's very important. At the top of this, do they actually ever mention at least one rare earth metal? They don't, because they never quite frankly tell you what they're for. But let's talk about the magnets. We tell you can use iron nitride, you can use manganese aluminum carbide, and tetronite, which are all less toxic and are more bioavailable. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
If the ban is effective on opposition, regulation is effective on proposition. We can mitigate all of the environmental harms they claim. This is not the important delta.
We tell you mining in and of itself is bad. Even though you just like pick up the nodules, you disrupt the environment because there's animals that are dependent on those nodules, right? So what is the impact of this that you have less rare earths on our side? We tell you that you have to one, use less of them, but two, innovate more, something we already talked about in the first. Right. So now on my split argument, how it specifically harms the developing countries. Firstly, the demand for these metals is nearly exclusively in rich countries. The poorest countries, comprising of 15% of world population, make use of only 1% of the products made from these metals mined in the deep sea. Secondly, nearly all the most important mining will be done in the CCZ. The 9 richest countries have already divided a large portion of the zone between themselves and already made exclusive private contract if it were legal to mine. But thirdly, given this motion gives proposition the burden to do this suddenly, you give a large advantage to the biggest economies that have the naval capacity to have a lot of boats. The resources to do this costing millions and hundreds of millions of dollars. But thirdly, the efficiency in government to make quick deals with smelters and like producers will then buy those minerals from you, right? This means that there's only place for like 30 countries in the CCZ, so there's going to be a huge race for the bottom, even if companies get involved, right? Secondly, on culture, we tell you a lot of people are dependent on fisheries and the ocean for products and culture, right? Why is that? Firstly, fisheries are part of your culture. You make your national dish from fish. Your dad worked in a fishery, your granddad worked in a fishery. It's a tradition in your town. But secondly, the ocean is culturally important. Whether there's myths of like the big eel that gave your people food 1,000 years ago, or they just like take it as a sacred place. And imagine the anxiety you feel once someone goes and bulldozes your sacred place, kills the fish that your father and your granddad ate for lunch, kills the livelihood that your parents and your grandparents had. Please, judges, step out of our Western bubble when we are like individualists and care only about money. These people care about their culture deeply. This is something forming for them, and the sea is so important for them. For all these reasons, never been prouder to oppose.
I'd like to thank our speaker for that. So please have a call for the proposition.
Volume check, this is fine. Even if the ban is theoretically better, one factor reality opposition cannot defeat in this debate is the fact that China and the US is currently mining in the offshores and in the deep sea, despite the fact that the ban is in place. We've provided you effective incentive and capacity analysis as to why this is true. 3 things in this speech. First, on the collapsing of the duopoly. Secondly, on the environment. And lastly, on preventing disputes. First things first, let's chat about the collapsing duopoly. I just want to first talk about the impact because they accuse us of not having an impact. The reliance in China and the US is currently debilitating the country's technological capacity as well as holds back the research and innovation the whole world stands to benefit from. Because the one analysis we provided you from second to no response was this idea that currently the rare earth minerals pose such an importance to the global industry. It is such an important thing. You just cannot give you things like green technology and assume it will fly. Because countries and companies on both sides of the house have strived for efforts to just, find out the alternative sources but have failed to do so. And this is the reason why we are having this debate to begin with. The rare earth minerals is such an important thing for your technology to begin with. Which is the reason why having a monopoly in the US and China is currently such a bad thing for them. Now then, let's take a look at the laundry list of attacks they launched against us. The first and the biggest claim the DLO makes is that the USA will not do this illegally because of the backlash, because they have to do it in easy, things like that. There are 2 responses I want to make at the top. 1, this isn't even illegal in the first place. Because if you know how international law works, this is only illegal for countries who are statutory, the treaty to begin with, right? So all of your analysis and the premise, which is that, this is illegal and therefore backlash happens, just does not apply in this debate to begin with in the first place. But the second thing I want to point out is that all of our analysis was much more nuanced. Our opt-in mechanism applies generally for the country, but does not apply for America. And the reason for that is that USA specifically has the clout and the capacity to just outweigh all of the incentives we provided you. And note, this is intuitive because the backlash they have posed to you has not worked historically when the US even literally engaged in a lot of wars and created war crime. And the reason for that, and the structural reason, is because no country is reliant on the US, whereas when you are talking about developing countries, you are reliant on developed countries. Even if you're talking about Japan, you're literally reliant on the US because it is a military alliance, right? Which is the reason why other countries relatively care about optics, but the US doesn't. Which is why opposition needs to defend the world without the US joining the ISA. Why wasn't this the tension? Because all of our analysis stood for countries in general. But I would go further. On their side of the house, comparatively, it is the countries that would likely opt out gradually as time passes. And this is critical because the US currently mines despite the ban that is currently happening, which is the reason why you are literally losing the competitive edge as time passes. Therefore, from the lens of the relatively strong countries like Japan, there's an active incentive to literally compete against the US companies on their side of the house. Here's the kicker. On our world, when we legalize, when we allow for the moderate mining in the deep sea, that's when a lot of the countries want to opt in. All of our analysis were comparative and their analysis wasn't. Before I move on to other analysis, I'll take that.
It's not true we rely on atoms. You have sodium ion batteries, manganese ion batteries, these metals are at least 100 times more abundant, and we prove you don't prove the urgency of climate change, so we can develop these due to necessity on our side of the house.
Okay, even if that's not true, although that's not true by the way, our argument wasn't really predicated upon it being the most important, at least it is an important material, we tightened that cap. Second claim they make is that the processing process will still remain in China. Why? Because the structural reason why is because the processing and tech machines are currently owned by foreign companies as well. Why was this the case? This is because the only reason why many companies from different countries currently move into China is because many of the materials are in the offshore, are in China in status quo, which attracts a lot of the companies. Whereas in our world, many countries can literally mine themselves, which is the reason why a lot of the companies disperse to other countries. But secondly, even if this was the case, who cares? Because our claim wasn't just about processing. Our claim was about the material dropping. This is because I think this just enabled all of our impact. Small countries with RAMs means that they can sell the rare earth minerals on our side more expensively. They're not likely to second with China's demands that exist in their world by virtue of them having expensive goods. All of that was just not comparative. The last thing they say is that duopoly is good for efficacy. Problem, they never proved the incentive of the US and China to do this effectively. All of our analysis proves to you, like number one, they have the incentive to capitalize off of them having a lot of the information and them having a lot of the materials in general, which is the reason why all of the analysis and how we're likely to have no competition which allows for perverse incentives stands. Why is this debate winning? One, this is the single biggest change in the debate. Opposition cannot deny reality, and in reality, deep sea mining, with all of its implications with environment, economy, or other things they care about, happens on both sides. The only change is who controls it. Secondly, this argument is logically prior to other classes in this debate. The lack of accountability resulting from Sino-American control of REM axis is precisely why China gets away with its aggression in the South China Sea. Third of all, the impact of creating competition and thus preventing artificial shortages in access barrier to REMs far exceeds any other impact in the debate, which is the reason why this alone wins this debate. Secondly, let's talk about the environment. The first claim they make is that mining itself is harmful. Clearly, this isn't true, because if anything, they themselves allow this REM mining within the EEZ, within the offshore on their side of the house. It's unclear to me why this is inherently bad. I think they would rather do it in moderation, and if anything, their side of the house is worse, insofar as the US and China does it without accountability. The second claim they make is that fish in deep sea will die, insofar as people will eat them. One, this is not comparative insofar as they would do it in offshore again, which is why this is just far worse in their world. The second thing I want to point out is that this is just not true. And the reason for that is that within the deep sea, there's a significantly less fish to begin with, little to no fish. And the reason for that is simple, right? These sunlights just don't reach the thousands of meters out under this deep sea to begin with. They say offshore mining is symmetric. This is not true. One, because of all of your analysis and environmental degradation. If it is true that environment is important for these countries, this is the reason why a lot of the countries, when it is legalized, would move into the deep sea mining. They say deep sea mining is not sufficient insofar as there's increased demand. This is also not true. One, because I think there's have far more sufficiency and far more amount of resources that currently exist in deep sea mining by virtue of a lot of the capacity and space that currently exists here. We've already pointed out this in our first speech when we told you the Clarion zone that currently exists in the Pacific Sea already have 5 times more resources than they currently exist in China. All of which is the reason why I think they themselves lose on the claim that they wanted to win in this debate. Finally, I want to talk about the disputes. I want to note on the strategy that the lack of response coming from DLO was just standing for their case. It's just not true enough. It's just too late for Upload to respond. The reason why this is more important than their claim in the environment, one, is because of the scale of impact. Sure, culture might be important, but the degree of change is just questionable. Whereas what we prove here is this scale of impact of a lot of the major countries fighting against each other, which oftentimes also affects things like the economy, which also affects things like the fish that they have talked about. A lot of the farmers and a lot of the fishermen are currently damaged by the South China Sea and its dispute, which is the reason why our argument had more scale of impact and our argument was more logically higher. For all of those reasons, we win at every time.
I'd like to thank our speaker for another excellent speech, and now invite Paul.
Ready? Is it alright if I speak at this volume? Speech starts on my screen. Our path to victory in this debate is very simple. We have told you that we do not need rare earth minerals because we still can have other alternatives that rare earth minerals crowd out. What is the irreversible harm that happens uniquely on proposition is the destruction of ecosystems of the deep sea, which we do not even know what the implications of that could be. The potential of the extent of damages is massive. A few issues in my speech. Firstly, about regulation and duopoly. Secondly, about landmines and the disputes. Lastly, on the unecology of mines and how this is so important. So firstly, about the regulation. I would like to note that they only gave you examples of USA minings, but we have given you analysis of why likely USA is still going to adhere to the same scrutiny. Because once it is internationally known as being like criminal or illegal, we tell you that still the international banks will likely not lend to the USA because the banks in those countries have to adhere to those conditions. Also, companies like Volvo also adhere to the laws that actually apply in the countries who are adherent to the ISA. Therefore, nobody will even buy that from the US. They still probably adhere the international scrutiny. And also, I would like to note that even with Trump, there are still people in the US who really like the environment, who like the nature. And if Trump is going to destroy these ecosystems, when everybody in the world is telling them that this is illegal and shouldn't be done, then likely this would really impact his approval ratings. USA is unlikely to do this on a large scale because they do not have the capacity and they do not have the incentive. But okay, let's say what they have said, that if the ban is effective on our side, the regulation will be effective on their side. Still, we tell that even regulated deep sea mining is still enough bad. I will prove to you this in another section of my speech about the unecology of mines. So now, to the duopoly, the dealing with China. They give this like strange claim that China has the monopoly on rare earth minerals because everything is mined in China. Why would that be the case? Just think about it, like a gut check. Why would the geography in China would be so unique that all of the rare earth minerals would be like naturally found there? We have given you the statistic that 40% of rare earth minerals are mined in China. Sure, but 90% of them are processed there. Therefore, countries have the incentive to go into China because China has the capacity, they have the economy of scale, they have the spectrum technology to process it there. What it means is that if more rare earth and more rare earth minerals are mined, they are likely still going to be processed in China. Why is this a direct harm on their side? Because on their side, they actually increase the scale of the rare earth industry. Therefore, if China has a monopoly and they increase this industry, therefore China has even more leverage and they have even more power because now they control a bigger section of the world economy. This is still a direct harm on their side. Now, so therefore, I've proven to you why the duopolies actually works on their side and why their impact should be fled by now. Now, let's actually deal with the disputes because this is just a very weird extension on their end. We tell you that likely USA is really not likely to do this in the South China Sea, exactly because it is contested by many countries, exactly because there are already the fisheries, everybody has facilities operating there. Where they are likely going to go is the CCZ, which is unoccupied by now, where they can take all of the territories, and now we tell you that there is a consensus among countries to not attack each other. If US and China attack each other's boats, this infringes everybody's ability to mine. Therefore, disputes with countries likely do not work. Now, let's deal with the land mines, another issue in this debate. They basically tell you, and their claim is, that they will get rid of the land mines because now there is no need to get them. I will flip this point and I will prove to you why land mines exist and when they are actually beneficial and why on their side it is worse. Because firstly, we have given you analysis of why there is still demand. In our second argument, on the crowding out of alternatives, we have told you that when scientists, when engineers, when companies know that there are rare earth minerals and they are going to be mined from the deep sea, that they know that they can be reliant on them, that they can make cars and technology reliant on rare earth because there is simply going to be enough of it. What this means is that this increases the demand for those rare earth minerals, therefore you still want to have the land mines. But okay, let's say that these rare earth minerals are more accessible, therefore it lowers price. But this just means that the employers of those mines and the owners have more of an incentive to abuse the workers. Now that they have lesser profit margins, they give less wages to those people. And now I actually get to the impacts of why these land mines are good. Do you think that they are held at gunpoint? Do you think that they are slaves working in those mines? No, it is because they have no other alternative. Because this is like the people who do not have money to afford food or who cannot afford housing. They are sending their children to those mines precisely because it is more valuable than going to school, because otherwise they would be starving. So therefore, if on their side they actually get rid of those mines, this is a direct harm on those people on the ground because they simply do need that money. Therefore, I actually played this one, they are better for those communities. Lastly, about their claim about deforestation and this stopping in those mines, I would like to tell you that there is a symmetrical harm on the seabed, which we have portrayed from our first speech. Why is deforestation better targeted? Because deforestation on land can be seen very easily. NGOs and governments can use, for example, open source satellites to look at jungle and look at areas where the jungle is like recessing, where deforestation is happening. On the contrary, if you want to do the deep sea, you would likely have to do it would be very costly because you have to send technology 4 kilometers under the sea. And yes, you might have some kind of water samples or something that they talk about, all those satellites, but still they probably take more money, they take more technology, there is likely less capacity to actually do this. Therefore, if the harm is symmetrical, we are better regulated. Now, let's deal on the metric on which we win this debate. We have told you in our second argument, which received absolutely no response, that there are alternatives that we can use. And now, even if we would be struggling in the status quo, still in time, this would force the companies to develop something better. We have developed past lead, past asbestos, past all of those harmful chemicals. On their side, they are actually relying on them. What is the large collateral harm this brings on their side, and why does this win us the debate? Before I move on, yes.
Companies already invested trillions into mining tech in the past 30 years. Why would they just suddenly give up and follow eternal ban in massive, massive debt?
No, we have given you reasons why the ban is effective, therefore it was illegal, companies couldn't do it. I don't really see why they would invest trillions in mining technology, this like it doesn't stand. Therefore, why is this so harmful? They only wanted to engage with the analysis, their only claim, their only response to this was, well, you heard the deep sea, and in deep sea there are no fish, therefore people do not eat them. My first reaction to that is that you simply do not know. We do not know about 90% of the species that are in the deep sea. The ecosystems are likely largely connected. Therefore, if we harm them there, it will harm even the fish on top. But okay, let's actually engage, let's bring back the analysis from first. We have told you that when you bring the debris from the deep sea, you bring it up. Therefore, it separates from the way that you bring it up 4 kilometers. Then when it reaches the boat, you only take out the nodules, the stones, and the dirt and the mud, you throw into water. What it means is that there is less light in the water. What it means is that it is now harder for the phytoplankton to do photosynthesis. What it then means is that firstly, you get less carbon capture, more oxygen, more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Also what it means is that when the phytoplankton die, the fish that eat it at the higher levels of the water actually die as well. The bigger fish die as well, and therefore people start dying because now people have nothing to eat. Also, and about the, like, okay, let's actually like weigh those effects. We tell you that this harm is like really irreversible because those organisms have existed in the deep sea for millions of years, undisturbed, with no light, with no disruption. You come in there with huge mining equipment, with huge lights, with a lot of sound that travels fast in water. This will disrupt the ecosystems forever. Irreversible harm on our side. We can deal with the duopoly in other ways. If we want to repeal like the human rights abuses for deforestation, we can lobby with NGOs. We can do other stuff. This is an irreversible harm because you destroy ecosystems that have been there for millions of years, and you force the communities living on those islands into miserable existence because now they cannot say, we are poor, but we are ourselves. No, you have taken away their identity, therefore these island communities likely struggle, they have nothing to actually cater to. For all those reasons, oppose.
I'd like to thank our speaker for another excellent speech and I'll close the line.
There are no countries deep sea mining ground right now. Side proposition lies directly to your face, dear panel, to try and prove a point, maybe because they're scared of a trade-off in this debate. In this speech, let's look at what happened here, how it ended up in this debate. But firstly, one strategic observation. See how we from first tell them they have to prove a tipping point. They have to prove a tipping point why we have to legalize deep sea mining now. Why we have to legalize deep sea mining now when most countries don't have the infrastructure, when most poor countries cannot afford to go deep sea mining. And they never explain the tipping point, never in their one of those pre-constructed speeches do they tell you we need to do this now. So at best, this harms their case of competition once you start deep sea mining now, when only China, the US, and maybe one other rich country could afford it. Okay, now it's a triopoly, not a duopoly. But also, let's look at what they tell you, because they tell you how important these rare earth minerals are. But they never talk about praseodymium, sammarimium, or gadolinium. Nor do they tell you what it's actually used for, and why is it impossible to use less or a completely different metal. Maybe because if they actually mention those names, you, dear panel, would know, oh, I've never heard that. Maybe they're not as important, and maybe something else can be used. As we literally said in all the speeches, how you already can use these things, and how already you start using different things, such as you started using lithium instead of cobalt in electric cars, or how you're starting to make like sodium batteries in the biggest automotive industry in the world, because there's a shortage right now that they try to solve, thus making us stuck with rare earths that we don't need, right? But please, dear panel, once we leave this room, look at TOP's content and ask, does it matter? What does a duopoly on some metals you never even heard about, that they never prove the importance of, and ask, what even is a duopoly? Why doesn't China and the US compete fairly? Because they're the two biggest powers, they're the two biggest competitors. Why would they together do a fake shortage rather than usurping the market once the other country falls short in supply? This is the only content that isn't dropped by side proposition, and the only content that is pushed throughout the bench on their side. The rest is dropped and thus unweighable. And then compare this with what we proved. The antibiotics that can cure bacterial diseases resistant to our antibiotics, that are unstoppable once they spread, because we have nothing to solve them with, because they have already evolved past our medicine. The fact that we are more ecological on one, the absorption, because they make the sea less absorbent of CO2. Every mining mission that they send, every time they bulldoze the seafloor, that's the point of which you make it less absorbent of the CO2. But secondly, every mission they send, they block a bit more sun going into the ocean, meaning there's a bit more photosynthesis in the ocean. And see how this is extremely important, because the ocean has 50% of the oxygen we breathe. Every second breath you take is the ocean, and that's something they disrupt on their side, right? This is a giant impact that they cannot just like run past in this debate talking about a duopoly. But secondly, let's talk about the poor coastal communities. They're dependent on fish, not only for food and livelihoods, such as 40% of the world population. The 40% that never heard of a duopoly, that never heard of a praseodymium, and never frankly cared about it, that are dependent on fish that they kill on their side. But not only that, they're dependent on them for culture, the things they actually care about. If you came to me and told me that there's no duopoly, I would not care. But if you came to a Polynesian and told him that you're going to bulldoze the land he calls sacred, that you're going to go to what he calls his temple with a large industrial thing and bulldoze it, kill everything there, possibly something he deems sacred, possibly something that he thinks is a god, I think that's an impact that has to win us this round. For all these reasons, please applaud.
I'd like to thank our speaker for another excellent speech, and I'll call upon the clock.
Sure. Okay. The first way we win this debate is on the environment. We did three things under this class. The first thing we did was prove effective regulation can exist in our world. The odd way to deal with this is to, very well with rhetoric, construct that mining itself is harmful in and of itself, and that we cannot regulate our way out of this. The problem with this case is, even if this were to be true, mining can still be done in moderation in our world, and the ISA has the incentive to do so. Obviously, the ocean is important. Every second breath may be the ocean. But that doesn't mean that necessarily mining destroys every second breath you do. Deep sea mining done with proper regulation can mitigate all of these harms. From framing, we not only told you that the ISA can effectively do this, but it is in their massive incentive to do this. Think intuitively, panel. Obviously, the ISA will legalize this in a way that minimizes harm. Second, under this touch, though we symmetricize the vast majority of their impact, especially to the local populace's opposition would most care about, because local EEZ mining still happens in both worlds, and they already cause symmetric harms. This means that local fisheries, for example, being destroyed by proximate deep sea mining locations still happens in their world because EEZ mining still happens. Finally, though, we flip the entire line of argumentation under this clash in two different ways. First, we talked about illegal deep sea mining. Their way to respond is to assert that illegal deep sea mining doesn't occur. The three mechanisms we get after they abandon the idea of regulation after I destroyed it from second is this idea that banks will lend you the money. The problem is, not only does the US necessarily not always need banks, like obviously they have taxpayer dollars to do a lot of this, but also corporations and stuff, like obviously, corporations and banks have profit incentive to do this. Then they say buyers would buy it. But obviously you can wash this money. You can wash all of this, right? Like you send it to China, mix it in with legal stuff, and then you sell it. You can't tell if it's illegal. And then they say the electorate cares, but obviously the electorate doesn't care. They're selfish individuals. It is a fact, panel. Bans don't and never have worked for the US. The other way we win the environmental clash, though, is on onshore mining. We weighed this from our argumentation and from second. Crucially, the responses to onshore mining that talk about increased abuse or how these people have alternatives, at the very least, even if we were to concede to all of this, doesn't engage to at least three of the mechanisms, the second, third, and fourth mechanism in our argument. Because these impacts are not necessarily about the local populace, but the larger environmental harm that occurs as a result of this as well, which means we aren't contingent on increased abuse on the local population. They don't respond to these mechanisms. Second question, on duopoly. Crucially, the gov way to deal with this is to argue that alternatives to REMs exist, and also that then this halts technology development. Not only is it entirely speculative if this technology is even feasible, obviously billions have already been poured into it, but if it is, they have no way of knowing if it is even better for the environment in the first place, and it certainly won't be better for competition, as the technology would be protected by IP laws and trade secrets and US tech export restrictions. Furthermore, obviously there's never going to be enough supply to meet the demand of REMs that currently exists anyway, so it's unclear if these alternatives are even sufficient in in the first place. In fact, enabling mineral processing will advance technology because it increases revenue for companies to reinvest into R&D and by supplying with the crucial elements required for this technology, which at least now are REM reliant. The other line of response is that processing is already done in China because this is symmetric. At the top, obviously, this doesn't engage with a lot of our analysis, which talks about the mining itself and the duopoly that exists there. Even if the processing is done in China, the selling and either for profits that you get from that can still be dispersed in our world. But furthermore, from GovWeb, we point out that it is because processing is done in China because the supply is in China. China is one of the unique nations who mine illegally because of their international power. This means 40% can be done in China. And obviously, 40% is massive. It is obviously most efficient to do the processing in China. And you comparatively shatter the duopoly because mining is done all over the world and each country gets it, which means you shatter the duopoly. From Naki's speech, we weigh this above the environment. Even if we lose on the environment, we can win on duopoly. Finally, on geopolitical disputes, although they argue that it doesn't happen, we posed 4 mechanisms to argue this does happen. Their response only engages to one of them. We would argue geopolitical disputes independently against this debate. Proposed.
I'd like to ask